Hello and welcome to Profiles in Innovation. I am your host Andrew Loy with Raj Kaushik, Director of Licensing and Strategic Alliances at Brandeis University's Office of Technology Licensing. Today's guest is Dan Perlman, a senior researcher and inventor who has created and developed a wide range of commercialized products. This includes scientific laboratory equipment and consumer products such as the SmartBalance range of spreads, bakery flour using coffee beans, and a drip-free glass wine bottle. So Dan, let's start by telling us a little about yourself and your background.
I came from my first postdoc at MIT, where I studied viral DNA replication, and came to Brandeis late, I believe, in 1978, so over 40 years ago. And I joined at that time, the Halverson Lab in the present Rosenstiel building, and studied baker's yeast and gene regulation in baker's yeast and the secretion of enzymes from baker's yeast, in particular the invertase enzyme, which is an interesting enzyme because it exists both inside the cell and outside the cell in different forms. Long story short, I discovered that these two forms of the enzyme, one being the secreted form that was glycosylated and the other cytoplasmic, which existed in non-glycosylated form, came from a single gene by the synthesis of two different mRNAs. And one led to the secreted protein, the other cytoplasmic. And that was kind of a very neat discovery, and one of the first instances in which a single gene produced two different versions of a protein. Anyhow, so eventually I spent some years doing NIH-sponsored research, and because funding grew very difficult for obtaining federal funding, I slowly morphed into research that could be supported by private industry, and I did a kind of a mixture of Brandeis research as well as industrial sponsored research. Some of this gave rise to patents that belonged to Brandeis, and some patents that ended up going to private industry. And that slowly moved from kind of developing products which were valuable for inside laboratory use, that is research kits and such, to applied food science. That kind of happened largely because I, by happenstance, met up with Dr. Hayes, who was in the biology department, who actually came from Harvard, and we arrived at Brandeis about the same time. And again, kind of long story short, he was very interested in metabolism of fats and getting away from unhealthy hydrogenated fats to kind of going back to natural fats in food products. And that eventually led to our collaboration to develop the SmartBalance fat blends, which are still sold today. And I wrote the patents for that, and kind of found some twists and turns that enabled our university to win patent protection for certain natural fat blends, which improved one's plasma or blood cholesterol profile. So SmartBalance table spreads are still sold across the country today, although our university no longer derives royalties from that because the patents expired. But for many years, that was very lucrative and supported a lot of activities here. And in fact, my arrangement with Brandeis was that my support, including my salary, would come from royalties earned from my invention work. The university was very proud of that. It was the product was called Brandeis butter for a while, table spreads, and earned our university at least $1 million a year in royalties. And that royalty flow now is, of course, sorely missed. But we've gone on to other things, and I've continued to collaborate to some degree with Dr. Hayes, who's now essentially retired. My interests have extended way beyond healthy fats to include the study of dietary fibers and vitamins that are needed by the body. Yeah, some other areas involved the so-called plant sterols or phytosterols. Plant sterols are made and found in vegetable oils and even in trees, and they are close cousins of cholesterol, but have the interesting property of actually mixing with cholesterol if they're part of your diet, and help the body get rid of cholesterol by passing through the GI tract and carrying cholesterol out in the waste. And so I made a discovery at Brandeis that plant sterols could co-crystallize with fats and become more readily available to the body, because normally they are rather waxy and not very, they're not water soluble at all, not to any measurable extent. They're fat soluble. And I found that when diluted into normal, vegetable oils and other fats, they would become much softer and more mixable with whatever is in your gastrointestinal tract to become much more effective at doing their job of carrying cholesterol out in the waste, whether the cholesterol is in food that you're eating, like animal fat, or whether the cholesterol is found in the GI tract coming from the liver. Cholesterol comes from the liver through the bile and into the GI tract. So that gave rise to products in which we combined, or companies actually combined plant sterols with fats and used them as part of the shortening during baking process. So over the years, basically, I've helped innovate products in which I've made largely natural ingredients more usable in foods and more effective, whether they're vitamins or whether they're, natural plant sterols, which are found in vegetable oils.
Yeah, so this is a great intro, Dan, and thank you for that. And Andrew, you also have set of questions which you'll go through, right?
So my question is a bit more general, a bit about Dan himself and in relation to the areas of Dan's research interests and inventions, particularly for the food industry. As Dan's already sort of discussed a number of points regarding his research and consumer-related products. I think that'd be a good starting point to sort of transition in, maybe. As you've obviously developed a number of, very noticeable, well-known food products in relation to consumer products, a lot of these processed food products are quite well known to have poor nutritional value, for example, high fat content. What are some of the challenges and experience that you have faced in developing these kinds of products?
Well, yeah, there have been a lot of challenges because companies are motivated largely by profit and not always focused on health. I mean, the companies that are focused on health are more if we're looking at ingredients that get that are eaten, that are consumed. You have dietary supplement companies that are interested in the science and actually charge a premium for their ingredients. But we have, with very few exceptions, not really sought out the dietary supplement marketplace. And the problem with the food industry is that processed food manufacturers want to minimize costs, and that has been an obstacle and remains an obstacle, and runs often contrary to good nutrition, because the healthy ingredients tend to add cost to products, whether you're adding plant sterols to help control blood cholesterol, or whether you're talking about the healthier fats. They tend to be more expensive than the cheaper fats. So saturated fats tend to be on the cheaper side. Palm oil is cheaper than, say, a high quality sunflower oil, or omega-3s, which are very, very healthy, in part 3 fatty acids, which are part of cells' membranes, that is fish oil, algae oil, those oils tend to be much, much more expensive than vegetable oils. So it's always a challenge to convince a company that's worthwhile improving the health profile of a product. And even if we're looking at, say, dietary fiber, a cellulosic fiber that comes from trees, ultimately, back to trees, that they tend to be cheaper than the healthier soluble fibers that are, whether we're talking about inulin or pectin, so it seems that the healthier ingredients tend to add cost to products. And so that's always been a battle. And a company has to be able to advertise, basically sell a healthier food based on its health benefits. And if it can't do that, it's not going to succeed. Or you'll introduce something and the product will fail because it doesn't have a large enough audience. In terms of introducing new food science, that's been probably the biggest challenge. There are some exceptions where there's a mainstream food. I'm thinking of one technology which actually I developed as a consultant outside of Brandeis, which is case in point of, say, peanut butter, which is a incredibly popular food in the US, less so in other countries. But peanut butter is so common that and parents, of course, buy it for their children, making peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. That was a case in which making peanut butter a little healthier wasn't as hard to sell. Again, the same company that introduced the healthier table spreads, that was the SmartBalance company. Well, they were known as SmartBalance. They're actually GFA brands. They recognized that if we could add something to peanut butter to make it healthier, that would be a win-win, because parents would want to feed their kids a healthier peanut butter. So I introduced omega-3 supplementation to peanut butter, and that was and continues to be quite successful. In this case, we're not adding the healthiest of omega. Fish oil, again, there's a case where people, there's something that is somewhat runs contrary to peanut butter being an all vegetable product. People didn't want to add animal fat to it, so they're not adding omega-3 fish oil, but they're adding omega-3 flaxseed oil, so it remains a vegetable product. So in some instances, you can add a little bit of cost to a mainstream food product, and it's an easier sell than, say, adding phytosterols, which are a costly additive. And yes, there is an audience for people who want to reduce their cholesterol level in the blood, but it's a harder sell, and particularly because nowadays, if you have a cholesterol problem, you're more likely to take a statin drug to get even a more substantial reduction in control of blood cholesterol. So yeah, that seems to be the major challenge, is as well as timing. Another major challenge in this whole business is timing, because you can have the best technology, but if a company is busy introducing other products or doesn't have the revenue to do the product development R&D and introduce the new product, they're not going to take it on. So often it's a question of finding the right company and the right timing. Rajneesh, you can probably validate that, right? That it's finding the right company and the right timing to convince them to take something on. Oh, another instance of that was I actually got into coffee technology at a variety of levels, and I actually researched optimizing kind of the ideal particle size for extracting the most coffee flavor out of ground coffee, and thought that would be a terrific addition technology to the K-cup, which is, the disposable little single-use pod of coffee. That was a case where, companies just didn't want to be distracted from what they were already doing that was earning so much money. We didn't really succeed in finding a partner that would be willing to spend the time and, alter their process that they already had in place for producing coffee pods. Why should they, if they're already succeeding, why substitute one thing for something that's slightly different? It's the saying in the field, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Why change something? Why substitute one thing for the other if they're already satisfied with the revenue stream that's coming from coffee? And then the other coffee technology that we've developed is, and I'm still very hopeful that will succeed, is using the coffee bean to make a coffee bean flour, which has a better nutritional profile than roasted coffee as a flour ingredient. So obviously most coffee goes into beverage, but the coffee bean can be milled to a fine flour, and it has nutrients which are very beneficial. Other than the caffeine stimulant effect, coffee beans are very rich in natural antioxidants, and if you don't roast them to too high a temperature, you can preserve those antioxidants. So that's a new concept that we're working on, again, on licensing to mill the coffee bean, actually to bake it, rather than roasting it at a high temperature, baking it at a lower temperature to preserve the nutritional ingredients in the coffee bean, and then milling it into a fine flour. So that's a new concept. So yeah, it's a challenge at a variety of levels.
Well, you've obviously developed a number of consumer-based products. Like, where do you tend to typically get your sources of inspiration for like new ideas and developing these into actual products?
The motivation. Well, I'm tend to be a foodie type person. I have always liked to work in the kitchen, to cook and bake, and being a consumer of shops in supermarkets or Trader Joe's, I've always had my eyes out for looking at products and how one could either incorporate the product into something else or improve it. So I've kind of like have a natural tendency to, or a critical eye when I see processed foods on the shelf. So yeah, I guess it's my natural instinct is to be the devil's advocate when I it seems to come naturally that working with food a lot, I tend to wonder whether food ingredients can be altered in terms of the nutritional side or the flavor side, for that matter. I enjoy
Dan,
making
I was also going to mention, and perhaps Andrew may ask subsequently, about other products which you have come up with, like a lot of laboratory equipments, like Bell Arts sort of thing. So if you can tell us a little bit more about it and how you get inspiration for those things.
Oh, sure. So again, but it's kind of the same eye as as a devil's advocate. So having done laboratory research for going on probably 50 years, I've looked to make it easier to do certain things in the lab. So yeah, I've often looked at gadgets, instruments used in lab research. Case in point, many years ago, I used to deal with cryopreservation, keeping samples that are perishable in the lab are often stored at very low temperatures not in conventional freezers, but freezers that are kept at more or less dry ice temperatures or lower, minus 70 degrees centigrade below. And if you try to identify samples that you store at very low temperature by putting on an identification tape, it was my common experience, and countless thousands of other researchers, that often the identification label in the course of going down to very low temperatures would pop off and be lost, and then you wouldn't know what sample corresponded to what. And just through a source, because that was an annoyance, I just wondered whether there would be a better material to produce labels that would survive cryogenic, low temperature freezing. And I found certain adhesives which were conducive to surviving repeated low temperature storage in terms of the thermal shock and in terms of the frost and moisture and all that. And I developed a cryogenic label that continues to be, used today, although again, I think that's a patent that long since expired. And then I found that another instance of that in which I was just frustrated with something in the lab was the tiny microcentrifuge tube, which is kind of ubiquitous throughout the world. When you centrifuge very tiny samples, you use very tiny centrifuge tubes. When you put them in the centrifuge rotor, you use either your fingertips or a gloved hands to insert and remove them, and they lie very flat, and they can be awkward to insert and as well as extract from the what's called the rotor, the centrifuge rotor, difficult to grab. So I actually filed patents to tubes in which in which the lid of the tube included an extension tab, which made it easy to grab, to both insert and remove the little tube from the rotor.
So when it comes to developing these actual products, then what are some of the core factors that actually influence the way you approach developing your methods and your technologies?
What influences it? Well, being self-critical is very important, because I've learned that you can have new ideas, but if they're not practical to implement, they won't go anywhere. So learning to be pretty self-critical is a very important ingredient in the process of innovation. So, for example, in that case of the centrifuge tube, I had to, before I approached a company and found a major company to manufacture tubes, which are injection molded tubes out of polypropylene plastic, I had to figure out whether it would be fairly easy to modify the existing process of making those tubes. So it involves, digging into the process of making things where I didn't have that experience, that expertise in advance. So learning to, wonder not only whether you could improve something, but whether it would be practical, physically practical to make it, and not too expensive. So in that case of making the centrifuge tube, I had to think about molds, the steel molds that are used to manufacture the product. And as it turned out, the molds that would form the lid of the tube could be modified to add a tab. In other words, if you're adding plastic to an element, you're actually removing metal from the mold that is used to form the tube. So it's much easier to remove metal than to add metal to so it's things that are as simple as that, is to think about the process of making it, not only whether it's going to be easier to use and more practical, but thinking about what's going to be physically pretty simple to do, and therefore, when you take that idea to a company, the company has to, the first thing they're going to look at is how would they implement that invention, right? And is it going to be, will they have, in the case of manufacturing a plastic product, are they going to have to start all over again from the beginning and make expensive new molds? Or can they just modify a mold that they already have by, in this case, removing a little bit of the steel from the mold, which allows for adding a plastic tab to the lid. So that's just one instance in which you have to be critical. And then there's the whole picture of, where should I take this idea? Should I take it to a very large company or a small company or a middle-sized company? And I think, Rajneesh has had this experience because their office has to find partners, and over many, many years, just by trial and error, I've found that often the right partner is, say, a middle-sized company. If a company is too small, they don't have, may not have the revenue to implement a new idea very easily, or they have very small workforce and they can't dedicate a person to the new idea. On the other hand, if it's too large a company, they can't be bothered by a little improvement. They're already making money that they're saying, oh, this just isn't worth our while. Whereas a mid-sized company will say, okay, this is interesting. If this idea is successful, it'll allow us to grow our revenue or become more visible in the world of laboratory products, say, if that's their business. So it's the process of innovation is multidimensional, because in addition to timing and the practicality, you have to think about taking the ideas to the right company.
So you touched upon the actual, in terms of like the disposal of resources or available resource, depending on the size of the company, as you said. But in relation to the actual, like, kind of, if you go back to sort of the academic research area, in terms of the current like level of sort of scientific understandings and technologies, how has this actually sort of impacted the way you've approached coming up with ideas and creating products?
Well, that's I'm not quite sure I catch the drift of your question. I mean,
so for example, if you have a novel idea, but current technological capabilities mean that you can't like feasibly or realistically create that idea at this point in time.
In other words, are you asking whether I'm kind of going up against an obstacle where the technology to make the invention doesn't yet exist, or
potentially, yes?
Yeah, I don't think that I've ever. There may be some exceptions there where we've run up against technological barriers, but usually these are not very complicated technology. As a matter of fact, I tend to gravitate towards innovation in which the technology already exists. So it's putting together capabilities which already exist, but they haven't been brought together, where technology A exists in one area, technology B in another, and bringing these two parts together where they haven't previously been brought together.
Yeah, I think case in point is, your inventions related to laboratory tools, research tools that, like, you have actually you have worked to make them simpler.
Yeah. If I were to look through my patents, so I have about 100 US patents and a bunch of foreign patents, and it'd be hard for me to think of any one in which it required developing a new core technology. For example, I mean, in my department at Brandeis, I'm thinking of microfluidics, in which you're fabricating infinitesimally small channels, and you have to develop almost, new methodologies for fabrication, for microfabrication or nanofabrication. So you're up against new technologies. No, I can't think of anything. Even say in the case of fabricating, we have a fairly recent patent that in which I, again, being a foodie and a person who likes wine, I was tired of constantly seeing red wine drip down the side of a bottle and stain the tablecloth or your tabletop. And so this is going back, I don't know, 7 years or so. I asked myself whether one could alter the architecture of the top of the wine bottle so that when you stop pouring wine, that residual wine droplet or droplets wouldn't drip down the side of the wine bottle and stain the tabletop. So we, experimented basically with grinding glass, conventional existing glass bottles, using simply to figure out what would work, what would stop that wine drip. We had to, learn a little bit about how would you grind, rather than, it would be very difficult to start casting and molding sample bottles out of glass. It's a very, very complex and expensive process to mold glass, to make new molds. So rather than doing that, I started out and spent probably over a year working with our machine shop to cut and grind different designs into the top of a wine bottle to alter the lip shape. And, we came up with a couple of different themes and tested them, and really finally succeeded in a glass architecture where the wine, pours cleanly out of the orifice of the bottle without dripping. And there's a lot of trial and error there, but we were using, conventional technology. I mean, people are not usually taking a wine bottle and grinding the glass. It's difficult, but we brought conventional technology that existed in a machine shop for, basically rotating an object and grinding it to put a wine bottle in the same kind of geometry, and very carefully grind it and cut the glass so that we could test out different architectures. So we're again bringing know-how and methodology from one area, which is basically rotational lathe technology and grinding, and very skillful people in our machine shop were able to make different architectural modifications of the wine bottle. And then after that, we got a series of companies to actually make single mold changes and test out the designs in actual molding of glass. So we're at a point of now working with a company that is molding glass bottles, and we expect them to soon be bottling wine, in bottles that don't drip.
Well, yeah, it's quite clear that obviously large majority of your research interests are being focused on consumer-based products. You mentioned that you have quite the passion for food, or foodie rather. Have you ever thought about considering your work being applied to other areas of the culinary space? For example, gastronomy?
Yeah, well, in case of say the coffee bean, which everybody thinks of the coffee bean just going into beverages, Yeah, we've actually brought that to some bakeries and successfully baked a whole variety and demonstrated that the coffee bean flour can be added, in modest proportion to, say, wheat flours and used to bake all kinds of delicious pastries, from muffins to French croissant to Tuscan bread. So we've actually shown that the coffee bean flour is a great additive, which adds again both caffeine to breads, where bread doesn't normally contain any caffeine. So in the case, say, of a breakfast muffin, where you might not want to fall asleep after eating a caloric muffin, having a little caffeine combined into the muffin gives you a little bit of the coffee effect, the caffeine, while you're getting beneficial antioxidants. So that's one case where we've gotten into the culinary side. And then I mentioned peanut butter. So, well, it's not affecting the flavor of the peanut butter, but the coffee bean flour adds a very slight nutty flavor to the breads. It's very slight. Again, if you want something to be popular, you don't want to grossly alter it unless you're, dealing with herbal ingredients and trying to alter the flavor.
So in terms of the actual, I guess, the food industry landscape itself, namely area of processed foods, where do you see it going towards in the future?
Well, that's a pretty broad question. Where do I see it going?
Just some of your thoughts, yeah, based on the research that you do and from what you've seen in terms of other research interests from other researchers.
I mean, the new
Yeah,
products and all, what's coming to the market.
yeah. I think that more and more novel nutrition is being uncovered, whether it's sources of omega-3s in, for example, seaweed cultivation, which has been common in Asia, I think is coming more and more to the U.S. so that there are this commercial harvesting of seaweed and that becoming a food ingredient. And in fact, the omega-3s are not made in any significant amount by animals. They're actually getting into say fish oil from plankton sources and vegetable algae. So I can imagine there'll be more use of natural products that are inherently healthy but underutilized, and that's the case. Say, I've encountered people who've gotten into cultivating and harvesting seaweed. As a matter of fact, in New England, in cold waters up in Maine, for example. Also, the other thing about, say, in the production of fish, more and more fish species are being farm raised now, and I think that they're, because with the depletion of natural fisheries, when you shop now, it's just more and more common to be buying farm raised fish rather than wild caught fish. And I think that that's a trend. But again, I think that there are big opportunities there to improve the nutrition of farm raised fish, because, as you know, for example, the beef industry's come under a lot of scrutiny because, cattle that are raised in and fed grains, just, corn and soy, for example, they're not as healthy as the meat produced from animals that are grazing on open land. And so the food product itself is a large, that old saying, you are what you eat. Fish and cattle and what have you are, the fish or the meat is not as healthy because the animals are not being fed as healthy a diet. And so I think in the case of farm-raised fish, the meat, the fish product is just not as healthy as wild-caught fish because their for example, their level of omega-3s are much lower. Farm-raised fish are relatively low in omega-3, whereas wild-caught fish are higher because of what they're eating. Wild-caught fish are eating algae, phytoplankton, and that's where a lot of the health comes from. So I think that there's an opportunity to understand more about nutrition in the case of farm-raised fish. A lot of room for improving the quality of farm-raised fish nutritionally by providing a healthier diet. But again, it can't be too expensive because, corporate fish farming is just not going to, it can't, you can't feed fish very expensive meals.
The nutrition is obviously a very big factor going forwards, which ties into a lot of sort of the health related areas. Just moving on into terms of like your own sort of like personal interests. Obviously, your background is more formally in biology, is that correct?
Yeah, my background is molecular and cellular biology is what I worked on in, years ago towards my PhD, which was at the University of Wisconsin. So
in relation to that, could you tell me just a little bit about like why or what about biology is it that you find sort of really interesting or passionate about?
Well, I was always drawn, going back even to high school, I was always drawn to biology more so than chemistry or physics. And I had a wonderful high school biology teacher who was, fascinated by the world around and conveyed his excitement about the natural world to students. And I think that he was very influential. I think of all the science courses that I was exposed to in high school, I think biology was most exciting to me. And I had even in junior high, I think I had a geology course, which was kind of fun, but didn't excite me the way biology did. But I had kind of a naturalist biology teacher who was into really, bird watching and shared his fascination with nature with the students. And as a matter of fact, I recall this teacher at some point had a bunch of baby squirrels that came from a large tree having been cut down, and he brought a cage full of baby squirrels into the classroom and asked whether anybody would like to try to raise them at home. I don't think that would pass muster these days with the the regulations, but being in junior high school, I actually volunteered and took a baby squirrel home and nursed it till it was large enough to release into nature. And it was a wonderful experience of figuring out how to actually the nutrition, what would you feed a baby squirrel to allow it to survive and grow, but way before it was ready to chew open peanuts and what have you and get into an all nut diet. I learned out it, came up with a formula, to feed this baby squirrel, and it thrived. And that was a major plus. But yeah, I was always fascinated with the natural world, and and I also grew up in a small town and near the water, and I was an avid kid going fishing and crabbing and clamming, and so I had a lot of natural food.
So as your career obviously started out in biological research, and as that evolved into more areas of applied research where you started to develop and create inventions and products, Because you're, as an inventor right now, your area is a bit more sort of interdisciplinary in relation to sort of like, there's a mix of like biology, there's a mix of chemistry and material sciences.
Yeah.
How have your interests changed over time, going from purely biology background to now?
Yeah, they have morphed. I think at first it was a matter of survival because it became a matter of finding, with my skill set of research but with the difficulty in raising money through federal grants at some point, it was a matter of practical survival. Because one option would have been just changing careers and going into business or something like that. And so, in fact, where federal research funding was very difficult, I found other sources, by going towards applied, more towards products. There was that avenue where if you can apply what in terms of science and how to do research to things where you're producing goods and services, there, that, to me at least, that was an easier route. And fortunately, the university was supportive of that direction. So I don't know whether that answers your question, but so it was largely a question of, what am I going to do in terms of career, where I don't want to be knocking my head against a stone wall where it's too difficult to raise money, and finding that, it was challenging and actually enjoyable to create things that were more of a practical nature than purely academic.
Okay, so as a seasoned inventor yourself now, what are some of the other important lessons that you've learned throughout your career?
The lessons. Well, I think we talked about that earlier, that ideas have to be feasible and practical to implement. They, ideally utilize methods which already exist and where the cost of implementing them is not going to be excessive, because companies are not prone to lay out a great deal of money up front. So you have to be able to present an idea to a company and convince them that the amount of money and even the timeline is feasible, and hopefully actually have invested, the time to actually, what Rajneesh would call reduce it to practice. In other words, you don't take just a pie in the sky idea and take it to a company, like, wouldn't it be great if we make so and so? You have to actually take an idea and demonstrate its feasibility, and either provide a prototype and be able to demonstrate that, and convince a company that it's going to be straightforward, right, in terms of both investment of time and money, that it's going to be feasible. At least that's the area in which I invent. It's different if you're in the pharmaceutical business and you're going to cure a disease or come up with a vaccine for COVID. There's such a compelling need there that the company is prepared to invest millions and millions of dollars to bring something to reality. But in the area in which areas in which I invent, I have to be able to essentially show a company that it's practical, that it's cost feasible, and it won't take too much time, because you're competing against a lot of other ideas that are coming through the front door of the company.
So I'm
going to say that I encounter that routinely, that I'll bring an idea to a company and they'll say, wow, that's interesting, but we can't consider it in this year's budget because our funds and our people are already committed for the next year. Why don't you come back in the next fiscal cycle and let's talk about it, like a year later from now.
Yeah, exactly. So in terms of the actual learnings, just finally, one last question. If you could only give one piece of advice to budding scientists or students looking to pursue a career in science, what would it be?
Advice to what? Oh, you mean would-be inventors?
Any levels, like younger or students who aspire to be scientists later on in their professional careers?
Well, you have to have, I mean, I think that you have to naturally be curious and motivated to, before you go into the sciences, you really have to find it fascinating. Something that's fascinating, that captures your imagination. But then if you want to translate that further down the line, and you specifically thinking about wanting to invent, then you have to really dig pretty deep before getting too excited. I've had quite a number of people bring ideas to me, and I try to show them, going through the process of feasibility, right? Is this something that other people are going to be excited about and want or need? And again, is it feasible to make this, in a reasonable period of time with a modest amount of money? And so you have to be your own devil's advocate, or talk to other people about it to figure out whether it's feasible. But in terms of, just whether to go into the sciences or not, I think it's a question of whether you have a natural curiosity about whatever field it is. I mean, I think that applies to almost any career. I mean, if you're interested in literature, you have to find it, that putting words together or reading is just fascinating. I mean, I think that it's wonderful. I love to read, and I love to see how different authors put words together and create entirely different moods depending upon how they put words together. It's an incredibly creative process too. I think with the sciences, you have to find that biology, you have to find that nature is fascinating, the way things are put together in nature. If you look at a bird flying through the air, I mean, it's like it can be pretty fascinating to see how that animal is evolved to be able to launch itself off. I mean, I live in a house, and I have trees, and I have a bird feeder, and if you just watch it and you find that fascinating, you may want to get into something having to do with biology. It's just, there has to be curiosity and fascination that moves you to to want to explore it.
Well, I think that's it. Well, Dan, thank you very much for taking the time out to talk to us.
Yeah, it's been very enjoyable.
This is Profiles in Innovation signing off. If you're interested in finding out more about Brandeis Innovation and the work that we do, please visit brandeis.edu/innovation. Thank you for listening. Take care.